Sí, para tocar porque sí, acabé de crear otro link para ver si lo cogía, pero tampoco.
Yeah. But what's annoying is when they ask totally irrelevant or really complex questions, which is like, so what was your question? You know,
Porque no
or these
funciona.
hypothetical questions are just, you know.
¿Y cómo lo puedo? Do you know how can I share?
I'm not that. You think you know, or it's that area.
I hate this.
So I think you just manipulate
¿Cómo? No, es que él sale que la cámara configurada es esa, pero está cogiendo la de mi computador. Y él sale que la configurada es esa. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Lo que pasa es que como lo cerramos y todo, tengo que mandarles el nuevo link. Porque lo cerramos para que volviera a empezar. No, ese es ahí. Ah, okay.
All right. As you guys can see, we're still struggling here, but we're going to get started. Otherwise, we have an online audience as well. More people coming? Oh, sure. We have an online audience as well. And the idea was to capture it with this new camera that we just bought. We spent a lot of money with. It is a camera, otherwise you wouldn't see it. It is a camera that captures.
Now it is.
Pero
Hombre, está frozen.
Well, Natalia will try to figure this out with the help of Ricardo. Where's Ricardo?
I think it's looking.
Come over here. Help her. Come over here and help her because we don't want to do this
No, that was
across.
from before.
The camera, otherwise it will not be looking. It's the camera. Come over here, Ricardo. Let's do it while we get started.
No, that's from before. Porque la couldn't view.
no sé qué cámara es.
Está atrasada, mira.
It doesn't say live.
Yeah. I'm not standing over there.
Right, exactly. That's what I think is delayed.
All right, so they will figure this out, but we don't have a whole lot of time. What we do have is we have other people that want to connect. They want to connect online, so that's why we want this to work. We have a working group, an African descendant working group. We have about 50 people associated to this working group from different universities across the world. Actually, we have people that might be connecting from Brazil, from Colombia, from Germany, from different parts of the world, and different universities, of course, as well. So that's why we want this to work, so that people that are in this working group can share. The idea is that people who work on African descendants on race issues can share their work with other people who also work on race issues. So then they get some feedback. So we only have until 4:45. We go a little bit over. I want to ask you to stick it out a little bit. Go a little bit over 4:45, but she will try to condense her talk to half an hour talk, 15 minutes for questions, and that's it. So Beatriz Padilla is a colleague of mine. She started here recently, last year.
August, yeah.
Last year, in the sociology department. Like in Portugal, and she was there as well. That was back in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, she continued in Portugal. She has done a lot of research projects in Lisbon, but on Portugal particularly, and then particularly around the issue of migrants on one side, children of migrants or second generation migrants, but also then people who are citizens, and therefore issues of citizenship, equality, inequality. In Portugal, as I mentioned earlier, we have a large contingent of people whose parents who themselves came from the former colonies but came to Portugal as citizens, and yet are not treated as equals in Portugal. That's a big problem. So we're dealing with colonial legacies. This class is about decolonization. It's about coloniality. So one of the understudied countries where you can see coloniality lived out today is Portugal, because colonial times in Portugal lasted till 74.
Until today.
So the former, you talk about coloniality, but colonial former, so Portugal had colonies in Angola, in Mozambique, and Cape Verde, all the way till 74. So today we live, the reality is created under colonial times, and that's what this is all about. So that's why it's in this class. Thank you for coming. I hope they figure this out. Ricardo, where is he? Don't go back there. Stay right here. I mean,
It's just like I was trying to send a new link because it created a new link.
So that the two of you figure this out silently while she starts
Yeah.
talking, and this can work.
So if you want, you can. Yeah, you could take a seat, and everybody is already watching you.
Let's find a seat.
And
Thank you.
yeah, it's just like I don't know what's happening. Like connecting the made it slower. I don't know what happened.
Sometimes, cuando está en la misma pen, es mucho más lento que si la grabas en el desktop.
Es que si es un Office nuevo, no coge, porque mi Office de Colombia está desactualizado y todo. Y tiene,
Bueno, este es como intermedio, porque la verdad que
y tiene lo que tiene el código de pantalla. Eso no le puedo meter cosas nuevas así.
No, a la computadora.
Sí.
Decir. Porque no está.
No sé, no quiere ni andar.
So this the PowerPoint is not one of go either.
Yeah, it's like you see, there's the
slides.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do it from my computer?
Yeah, this is gonna be.
We don't see. I think more than us seeing her PowerPoint.
You want me to use my computer?
Well,
For now. For her.
yeah, that could have made sense. Yeah, this is it.
Okay. Not yet.
Yeah.
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy that I can share with you some of my experience in research. I'm very interested in the identities that relate to migration, especially post-colonial migration. And this is a work that we did some time ago. It was a European project that took place among several countries, but I focus mine in Europe. So just look at the pictures. One of them is representing one of the neighborhoods where we work, Valle da Moreira. And then let me move on. So I'll try to be really quick in the beginning because then we don't have so much time. I'm going to present some background information about just maybe some like shots about the theories that I'm using. But starting with providing you Portugal in order to understand what's going on and what I'm trying to explain. And then I present you some findings from the 13G project. So Portugal and post-colonialism. As I said, I always say that is Portugal post-colonial or still a colonial? It's not, and this is kind of on purpose because the colonization and the Portuguese empire is very much lived up to today as if we were in the 60s and 70s. And the Portuguese think of themselves as very specific, very special. So they have this thing of this subtle way of doing things. They think that they're very special. So post-colonialism, Portuguese colonialism and post-colonialism go hand in hand. And the specific form of colonialism in Portugal is what is called the Lusotropicalism, which you probably are familiar with. Oh, you have heard about it because it's also, it was kind of the concept was coined in Brazil, but actually reflects the history and the idea of what type of colonialism was carried out by the Portuguese that also, left, an imprint also in Brazil. So Lusotropicalism is based on the assumption that the Portuguese people have a very special for harmonious relation with other people. They have great capacity for adaptability in the tropics, and inherently they lack of prejudice. So they do think of themselves, as people who are not racist at all. Valentina and Heleno talk about like 4 dimensions of the Lusotropicalism, or the type of colonialism of the Portuguese. So they mention harmonious relations, the colonial past, the ability to adapt, and cultural integration. So because they believe all of this, they think that they are a very open country, and that people that go there to adapt there, and that they integrate people, and that they're very intercultural. So this imaginary is still very present in today's life in Portugal. Kind of helps to explain what happened with migrants and with migration today. They see themselves as Portugal being as a welcoming country. They also think themselves of not being racist. So they play with the idea of subtle and flagrant racism, or the same thing with sexism. They think they're not sexist. So there's this subtle idea of them not being sexist or racist. Yet they're very condescending and patronizing, especially with people coming from abroad, especially from the former colonies. So they try to enforce this illusion of equality, which does not exist, but at the same time, this illusion kind of citizenship enactment, because people had this difficulty to kind of claim their rights. They think that whatever they give you is an act of generosity, not, oh, they're doing you a favor. It's not that you're fighting for your rights. So this is very subtle, but it's very much in the head of the Portuguese, and that has a real impact today. And this is also very disempowering for migrants. In terms of theoretical frameworks, I would like to mention the decolonial perspective as something that I'm very familiar with that, and I think it is just a very good framework to understand migration. Because especially when you understand the migration in the metropolis, which is the case, what I'm talking today, the migrants or the colonial subject from Africa in Portugal, the former metropolis. And, even you can also apply this to Brazilians, So in this sense, because it helps to explain how people from the former colonies are seen and perceived in Portugal. So I would argue that Portugal is a post-colonial state with a colonial mind, and they exercise this magic of domination, the subordination, and there's a legacy of colonialism which naturalizes social, racial, and ethnic discrimination. If you think of from the perspective of migration in general, both the European Union, but also Portugal, they need migrants, so they see the migrants as pretty much labor force. But at the same time, they need help with the demographic decline. So they need babies, they need young people that work and have families, but then they don't want to give them the rights to do that, or to have to really integrate in society. And so I think the migrants need to accommodate to whatever is given to them. Again, this idea of, we're doing you a favor. And this is very problematic. Also, you think of migrants and generations of migrants, because while migrants, when the first generation are open to endure many, difficulties, the descendants of migrants who are not migrants are not always agreeing to that. Because it was not their choice. They're there and they think of themselves as they're from there, but they're not seen as they are. While the first generation, the parents, they're more used to endure discrimination, and they don't resist discrimination as much as the younger generation. I think also transnationalism has to explain the idea of migration, but I'm not going to get into this because we don't have a lot of time. And I think the idea of identities, and I see identities also associated to identification process and identity markers that the youth of immigrant backgrounds use, which is also very much based on a lot of ambiguity. The 3CG project. So the 3CG project was the European project that was the aim was to explore the experience of, this is a very contradiction. So you're going to hear all these words. That experience of second generation migrated teenagers, which is, to evaluate and compare the different structural, cultural, economic, and social political factors that relate to the inclusion or exclusion in European societies and their belonging to this new society or not so new society, which is Europe. In this case, some of these concepts are very controversial, and even the concept that were used even for the title, because if you say second generation migrated, so they're either second generation or they're migrated, but how is the second generation migrated used? And then teenagers. And if you use teenager, it's different if you use youth because of the age frame. But we survived these controversies, and it was a very interesting project. So this project used a mix of methodologies, quantitative with a survey. I'm going to present some findings from that. Qualitative, it was a very ethnographic project. We did interviews, we did discussion groups, participant observations, we compared local and international. And then we did 9 different sites. So in Portugal, it was done in Lisbon and in Porto, in Spain, in Madrid and Barcelona, in Italy, in Rome and in Genoa. And then in France, it was done in the north of France, it was not in Paris, in Netherlands, in Utrecht, and in Germany, in Berlin. So we had so much to compare, but I'm not comparing today, just focusing on the Portuguese. So the target group was in general the youth of immigrant origin and the descendant of immigrant. And that was one of the first thing that we had to decide, because European countries are all at different stages of migration. So maybe while in the Netherlands, there were like several generations of migration, there were not so many generations of migrants in Spain, for example, or in Portugal. It depends on how you focus. And then we define youth in general to people between 15 and 24 in general, which is, there are like different definitions of youth. But we thought that was, especially for the quantitative and for the qualitative, would open a little bit, because people circulate in different spheres and trying to address these issues that I mentioned. So this is a map of Lisbon, with that thing in the middle being the Tagus River. And so those are the 2 neighborhoods that we selected, one in each margin of the Tagus River. One is called en Amadora, is 6 de Mayo, and the other one in Moita, which is in the south margin, is called Valle da Moreira. We selected this neighborhood because they had a history of migration, and this history of migration was related to the former colonies in different ways. While the Valle da Moreira also received returnees, that meant white people, Portuguese white people that came back from the colonies during the colonization, because it was very, very abrupt, but also received African migrants. So it was more of a mix. It was a planned neighborhood, so kind of social housing, but with very rundown infrastructure. There was very very close to the river, but at the same time very, very, very bad connected to the city, and there was a lot of stigmatization going on. While Amadora, 6 de Mayo, it was the first neighborhood where the Cape Verdeans came. And they came from the colonies even before the decolonization, because the Portuguese needed labor force, and so the Cape Verdeans were the first ones to come. And this neighborhood was totally unplanned, so it would be similar to like the shanty towns or like the favelas, kind of from Latin America. There's lack of any kind of space. You'll see the pictures, but they are very accessible to public transportation close to the city. Although they also suffer from the stigmatization. Those are 2 pictures. This is a picture from the neighborhood. Unfortunately, this neighborhood does not exist anymore. but that it was, it felt like a village where like people knew each other and had a very specific way to relate. And this is Valle de Amoreira, so it was planned, it's big. You see the picture down, the colorful picture is a graffiti that was made from the youth made it, representing that. So let me explain you a little bit and quickly the quantitative. So when we did a survey, applied the survey to about 600 people, 600 youth in the schools close to these neighborhoods, to high school students between the 10th and the 12th grade. But also we apply some technical or professional schools where it's also a lot of youth from migrant background go, and in some after school programs to kind of capture some of those who were out, of the system, or maybe who were a little bit older. And it was carried out by the professors or like the teachers or our research team. We interview people or survey people between 15 and 24. We made the effort to survey both national or autochthonous youth and the descendant of migrants in order to compare. And we determined that, or what we used to decide, it was if the parents had been born abroad or not, to kind of decide if they were descendant of migrants or not. And although we recognize that the sample has a bias toward like those students in the school system, but there was no many other ways to outreach them. So some features of the survey, 46% were national, 53% were of immigrant background. So these were done in the same school. So you see that was, it's not so common in the rest of Portugal to have schools that are so, that have so many youth of immigrant descent as students. In terms of gender, more girls than boys, but that's very normal in high school because there are more girls going to high school and finishing high school, while the boys tend to repeat and then drop out from school. The age, most of them were from 15 to 18, which is normal for high school, but at the same time, almost 26% were over 18. And then you'll see that in that group, there are more kids that were of immigrant origin, saying that, they tend to finish school later, and there's some issues with that. And also an interesting point is the family composition. You can see the family is very different from the autochthonous and from the children of migrant or children of migrant, because they tend to have largest like extended families or people with, a lot of family members. And this is kind of, it's kind of the same. But you can see almost 60% of the families of the children of migrant origin are really large, between 5 and 11 members. If you think of the country of birth, this is the breakout. So you see that a lot of them, were born in Portugal, but you can also see there, so there will be many of the first generation and then the second generation in different colors. And most of them, they come from, the former colonies. So it is very clear that they're like post-colonial neighborhoods. And you can see the colonial diversity of the students. But in terms of nationality, then you see some differences. While 56% were born in Portugal, only 49% have access to the nationality. So that tells you something already. And also the bias that we had in this sample is that if they're in school at that time, it's because they have papers to be there. If they were not regulars, they would not be in that school at that time. I mean, nowadays it has changed, but not at that time. So it's kind of biased towards that. I already talked about the family size. About the demographics, some interesting facts sometimes relate to the mothers. What does mother do? And here is a huge difference because you can see that mothers, work, but most of the mothers of the children of immigrant descent work as in the cleaning and domestic services. It's a huge difference. And this translates also, in their lives because they had to have more than one job. They usually work for like 5 in the morning to 11 at night, so they're never at home, and then they get blamed for that. They work long hours and also make very low wages. If you look at the fathers, it's a little bit more diversity, but again, you see the fathers also concentrating in the construction sector. So also, tells, it tells you a little bit of the difference. In terms of unemployment, the immigrants tend to be more unemployed, adjust to workforce. School performance is very interesting because you can see that the youth of immigrants to fail school much more than the others. But the nationals or the autochthonous also fail, almost 40% fail. What the immigrants is about is over 60%. So it's a huge difference, but they both tend to fail. And just this to show you with the, I was not going to talk about the other, but just to show you that the Lisbon case is very specific. It's really, it's like the worst of all the 9 sites that we did in terms of school performance. So it's a lot of the segregation and things going on in the schools. Maybe I can skip this. We asked them, how is that they identify, let me see. We were curious about how is that they identify, what their identities are, with what spaces they identify with, how is that people identify them or see them, and how is that they decide to identify themselves. So when we ask them about with what identity, like geographical identity, they tend to identify, you see the difference between the immigrants or the children with immigrant backgrounds and the nationals, especially the children of immigrant background do not feel as Portuguese as the other, which is obvious. Both tend to be feel more European, but the children of immigrants tend to have this more local identity. This local identity is associated to the neighborhoods, and obviously to the foreign identity is only the children of immigrants. If you take a look at this colonial diversity, the ones that tend to feel more foreign are Cape Verdean, which is kind of weird in the sense that they were kind of the middleman minority in relation to the rest of Africa. But they also means that, the ones have been there in Portugal, for longer and the most numerous, but still feel that they don't belong. And next are the Guinea-Bissau. What the people that feel less foreign is people from São Tomé and from Angola. So that's interesting. If you ask them, what is that they identify for all youth, migrants and non-migrants? The most relevant aspect is age. They feel young, so age for them is really relevant, and gender, being boys and girls, and clothing styles. It's very much similar. But then if, when you add other categories, you find religion, origin, culture, skin color being much more relevant, obviously, to the children of immigrants or descendants of immigrants, and also economic status, which also tells you something, right? So what happens if you ask them, how is the other people identify? So here you see that even though they say, well, I feel, that age is important, gender is important, then you see the difference because age is much more relevant for the autochthonous kids, while it is less relevant for the others because other aspects gain relevance. Again, origin, culture, skin color. So they know that people identify them as Black or as not being from there. And these go together, right? Because Portuguese cannot be Black in their mind. In terms of the identification, again, they feel much more identified with the neighborhood, and obviously with the culture of their parents, because it's also kind of it's an identity that they value, but also sometimes they feel that it's an imposed identity, right? When we ask them if there's racism in Portugal, well, everyone said there was racism. There's very few say none. But immigrants or the children of immigrants recognize more racism, and autochthonous kids also recognize that there's racism. This is a generational change because if you ask this question to older Portuguese, they will say that there's no racism. So, and where do they feel discriminated? So here you see what they experience. They feel discriminated in the stores, in pubs. They feel discriminated even in school. Also the other kids too. but more in school, in public transportation, in public institution, in banks. So all that is institutional, they do feel discriminated, with the other young people do not. So this is also a big difference. So if we contrast this quantitative information with the qualitative, this is, what we found. These pictures were taken from the summer workshops that we were participating, doing our ethnographic research. So those are the kids that participated. I think it's interesting because some of the things that they did, it was hip hop, graffiti, dancing. It was something that they really wanted to do, but at the same time, they were kind of learning to be African. So they would be learning African dances. So it's like a reinforcement at the same time of they're doing what they should be doing because they're African, right? So the ethnographic fieldwork involved a lot of participant observation at different levels. And we were observing issues of gender, if the interaction of boys and girls, age, because they were different ages, race, ethnicity, the power among the actors that were participating in the workshops, NGOs, and the dress, like the dressing code, the clothing, etc., etc. We did in-depth interview with youth, 20 of them, also with key informants that were present in the neighborhood. Oh, I forgot to mention that the ethnographic fieldwork was only done in Valle da Moreira because it was too much to do both. And then some discourse analysis on the lyrics that they produced as part of the workshop. The summer's workshop, they responded to their interests and to the resources that were available. Usually in this neighborhood, they're like not so much available, and there's always a lack of resources. And when they have it, the material that was available. So the workshop that they chose was the dance, hip hop, graffiti, video production, the lyrics, and the music production. So if we look at the young people that were interviewed, we classify them in born abroad and born in Portugal, with access to Portuguese nationality and without access to Portuguese nationality. So you had that. And really that shows that, having or not having access to nationality matters a lot in relation to your identity, but not only just having access or not to nationality, but also being regular, because a lot of them were irregular. And this is a very serious situation. So in terms of their own self-identification through the interview, they mentioned origin being important, nationality, culture, clothing style. Clothing style is always very important for them because they're young. Age and gender. In terms of origins, they see themselves as Portuguese, but sometimes they want to feel Portuguese. So being and feeling Portuguese, they're two different things. So it's want to belong, but it's not necessarily belonging. So it's different to be born in Portugal and to have your ID or your passport or your whatever, that being from there. And that's a problem for many of them. But also in relation to the origin, they also recognize the African roots. They enjoy recognizing the African roots, their own and not their parents, but it's different from their parents. It's more like a new version of African culture for youth. Not necessarily the one that the parents impose on them with some of the dances, some of the food, etc., etc. But they do, so they do have this kind of mix idea of this cultural mix, or this hybridity in terms of how they incorporate different elements of the culture. That would be even the language with the Creole that some of them speak, not all of them. If we had done this in the other neighborhood, most of them would have spoken Creole from Cape Verde, right? But in this one, it's a little bit different. Or the food or the music. And then in terms of identification by others, then you see that this identification for them leads them to this feeling and the experience of racism and discrimination. So skin color, being black or preto, which is the word that is used sometimes, or the origin being from Africa, or being immigrant, meaning that they're not from there. And the clothing style, that while they use or they see the clothing style as a positive aspect of this clothing style, as a negative aspect of their identities and identification. So that leads to a lot of experience of racism and discrimination on a daily basis and on an institutional basis. And so in this sense, they feel that they don't necessarily belong. They don't fit there. They don't feel accepted, and they don't feel integrated. So they feel this rejection in many of their interactions in the bus, for example, or in stores. If they get into the store, people get nervous. So very, very, old-fashioned. I don't know, I would say maybe from the 50s in other countries. But for them, the identification, for them, this clothing style is very, very important for their image and for the rapport. Or for someone that sees this as very, maybe not so much produced or not so careful, this is wrong because they do produce themselves. With the boys are very much into hip hop. They have very careful hair dressing. The accessories that they wear, that they use, is very relevant. While the girls tend to be more like pop girls, and the makeups and also the different hair dresses, those are very important aspects of their identification. But they also are aware that sometimes this aspect of their identities and identification make them target of prejudice, discrimination, racism. Which is, if you take a gender view or a gender perspective, is in this case, in most of the cases, it's worse for the boys, in the sense that, there are, criminals to be, people are more afraid. They're always associated with something really bad. For the girls, they're also stereotyped, but the stereotypes are a little bit different. So in this sense, the stereotype is worse. What about as a teen, I would observe identities or identification. Well, age, we discovered that, they're all youth, but they are not all youth. So there are different categories of youth depending on their age. And this is related also to, so first of all, they do talk about them. And them are adults, not necessarily white. So them are adults, as are young people, youth. So this is interesting. But what we found more interesting also is that these kind of different categories that mark their experience. So the older youth who have experienced and endure much more discrimination, especially because they either they finished high school or they couldn't finish high school, especially because of that, or they were looking for jobs, etc., etc. All this shows that life is tough. They have been discriminated. They have suffered from being regular and then becoming irregular. And once you're an adult, then you are being irregular, and then you can be deported. While when they're younger, when they're minors, this is it's an issue, but it's not. But they're minors. Once you become an adult, and you're still the same person, so you see this more like bitterness and angry. People getting more angry when they're a little bit older. Younger, they are aware of the discrimination, but they're much more optimistic, thinking, this is going to change. And although that they're also much more protected in their neighborhood. They don't have to go out of the neighborhood so much, while the others do. And then in terms of another observation in terms of gender, girls and boys, I mentioned about boys, but the girls, they do get a lot of pressures. There's a lot of gender expectations, so they had to take the role of, because mom is out working. Many times dad is not there. There's a lot of the absent father is very much present in a lot of their families. So they do have to cover up. So there's all this weight on them that they had to do. They had to clean, they had to cook, they had to do all those things because mom is out working. But boys are never put in that situation. So that's more like more conservative roles. And they have less freedom. Sometimes they're not allowed to go out, even in the neighborhood, even in the street, because remember that some of the neighborhoods are also very stigmatized. And also that from what we saw is that this denial of rights is, very much kind of shapes their identity. So nationality is a marker of their identity. So having and not having nationality really makes you more or less, for sure. There have been changes through, since we did this, but And it has really improved in terms of accessing nationality in Portugal, especially for these children, the children of immigrants, not just from Africa. But still, it's not enough because they are not providing retroactive rights, which I think is that what they should do. Because most of them, or when the family or the families arrived at a point, they were part of the Portuguese Empire, so they were Portuguese, but they were stripped from that citizenship. And then since then, they're having more problems. So if they were going to do the retroactive rule, which is very common in many legislation, that would cover this kind of gap that exists in Portugal today. But this is something that really hurts their feeling and not being, this idea of feeling Portuguese but not being Portuguese. So that's a lot of alienation around that. Maybe I can jump to kind of conclude. So in the Valle da Reira, we had to do the lyrics. This is from the board that they were using. So they had to describe their neighborhood, and I think it's very interesting that they use words that are sort of like nice and kind at the same time, but also that are very rough and very realistic. So friendship, love, social struggle, hip hop, education, youth at risk, immigrants, so people living, drugs, unemployment. So these are like the words they were, and with this they wrote a song, right? Kind of shows how is that they feel and how they see their neighborhood, which is where they spend most of the time. In terms of their identity, so having no access to the nationality kind of also went along with this continuum that we did to see how they would feel more. This is a continuum, so it's like ideal type. So between feeling Portuguese and feeling African, or being in the, like a mixed identity or in limbo. A lot of times this limbo. And so the identities are influenced by markers that, as I mentioned, culture, origin, nationality, and the clothing style. In Valle da Moreira, what I think is very interesting is I think that it is a neighborhood that you can consider Pan-African, in the sense that a lot of the African culture from the former colonies are represented. This is not so common. Like if we were in the other neighborhood, for example, it was pretty much Cape Verdean. So this is very interesting because it means that there are families, either they can be African from both parents, but from different countries. So that's why they don't necessarily speak the Creole from Cape Verde, because maybe the mom is Cape Verdean, but the dad is Angolan or from Mozambique. So it is really more like a truly Pan-African neighborhood in that sense, but they are struggling in between these Pan-African identities that sometimes is not very well understood, especially from the perspective of the parents, who are much more aligned with their own country of origin, and the Portuguese identities. So the young people or these youth are struggling for recognition, for belonging, for accepting the dreams. They want to feel Portuguese with African roots. So just to share narrative so this Nelson at that time was 26 years of age. He said, I was born in Portugal, but because I do not have a Portuguese ID, I cannot vote. I cannot join our troops, go to the hospital without people staring at me. There is always the idea about foreigners, and he's not, he was born there. But there's always this idea about foreigners that migrants come to steal the money of the Portuguese. And Nelson is a very interesting case because he was 26 at that time. He had lived there all his life. And but once he became an adult and didn't have the Portuguese nationality, he was really, really, really afraid of being deported, because if he was caught, and he had no roots, no family, nothing in Cape Verde. So for him, he's one of the one I think should be given, the retroactive nationality. And then we have other case, Jacinta, for example. She said she's from, her family from Angola. I feel more Angola here than when I go to Angola. There, they make me feel that I'm Portuguese. So it is kind of, you don't belong, or you always belong somewhere else. So I think what this young people want is a justice and change, and they see this as a dream. So what's the dream? The dream is to become accepted also as Portuguese, recognizes their African roots. We can say that the identities of the use of African descent in Lisbon are post-colonial, because they're the legacy of colonialism, and this legacy has not changed so much. Use the struggle to be recognized as Portuguese, but this is not very much accepted, and they do feel that people always see them as not being Portuguese because they're Black. So they want to belong, but belonging cannot be achieved without fighting racism and discrimination, including the institutional and society racism. And for that, I think that the colonial thought or the colonial idea or the colonial imaginary must be overcome. So it has to be set aside. And I don't think that has happened yet. Immigration and anti-discrimination policies in Portugal still rest on the idea that they're racist. So all the immigration laws, their starting point is that we're not racist. I mean, they score very well in the MIPEX with addresses migrant integration policies, but it doesn't mean that, they have still many issues. So I think without acknowledging this, it's very hard to get social justice for them. And then, thank you.
Thank you. Well, the technical difficulties, we really don't have a lot of time. I would say 2 short questions, 2 short answers is what you can do.
How does, from what I remember studying Brazil, is that the luso tropicalismo, it was sort of like Plan B. Like they couldn't whiten the country with the scientific racism that was going around at the time. So then they created a new narrative to show why the country's great. Do they try to even teach that it was a Plan B, that you are racist? Just the fact that you created this is racist. You know what I mean?
Right. No, I mean, they don't see it in Portugal. They don't see it as a Plan B. And actually, there's much less discussion on this issue in Portugal than in Brazil, which is very interesting. I mean, I know that lusotropicalism was coined by Gilberto Freire in Brazil, but it was based on this ideology of, the Portuguese colonizing, and conquering the world, and then kind of the Brazilians inheriting that special skill for mixing, blah, blah, blah. But they don't see it. And actually, I mean, the most modern step or stage, if you want to put it like that, after lusotropicalism or after this type of colonialism is lusophony. So they aim, especially the Portuguese, I mean, all of the Brazilians take advantage of this. They aim at outreaching all these countries from Africa that speak Portuguese. So they use the language as a sword. Although we know that a lot of people in the African country, I mean, some people speak Portuguese, but they also speak many, many other languages, and a lot of people do not speak Portuguese, right? So I don't think they see it as a Plan B at all, and they keep saying that they're not racist. So, for me, and I think it was for the case maybe for Bern, when you talk about now, at least it's for that in the last few years, but up to now it was no, you don't understand Portugal, because I'm not from Portugal. So you don't understand Portugal. That's why you think that this is racist. I don't know if you got those comments. So, which is, for me, it was so obvious that all this racism, but no, they don't see it because it's so much embedded and naturalized in the education. So they see it as normal. I mean, if you know from Brazil that, in Brazil, I had this quote, in Brazil, there's no racism, blacks know their place. It's the same in Portugal. I mean, I would say it would come from Portugal. So, I mean, which is obviously very racist, right?
Quick then, quick.
It seems like the categories Black, immigrant, and African are blended in one, in only one category in Portugal, and I think maybe that's why it's also hard for them to understand that it's what is actually racism or xenophobia or colorism. I don't know, but my question is it really like that? Are they synonyms? Like when Portuguese people talk about immigrants or Africans or Black people, how or which textures are there or nuances between these three categories?
I mean, you see the category of foreigners or not being from there because they're Blacks, yes. But the migrant or the immigrant category is broader. But for them, they can interchange, being Black, meaning that they're not from there. So that in that sense, they're foreigners. But the immigrant category is broader, just much broader than that. But in their case applies because they put together, well, you don't look like us, so you're from somewhere else. So in that sense, you are, a migrant. And sometimes they have difficulty trying to identify why that they're being discriminated. And sometimes it's very difficult. You don't know if because you are Black or because and then because you are Black, maybe you're not from there, so you're also immigrant. Are you also stealing the jobs of the Portuguese? So, but in their case, there's a lot of racism. So it's a race issue. Although, if we can add something that does not relate to the people from Africa, is that also Portugal is very, very racist against the Rome population, Gypsies, Ciganos. So much. There's like some study that show that. What's the worst of when people had to make categories? The worst that everyone is afraid is Gypsies or Rome population. So.
So I was wondering if your findings had any bearing on human trafficking in the area, and how maybe all this could have contributed to that different kinds of.
Well, no, not from this research. I think that a lot of the human trafficking that it would be with Africa. It would be probably more related to labor trafficking, that like sex trafficking. But Brazilians, if I can put the other, Brazilians are more associated with human trafficking, but at the same time, because they're also associated with sex trafficking. So not so much African in Portugal. But sometimes also some women from Nigeria, which is, but not so many cases. But also human trafficking is a very difficult issue because it depends on how you identify the cases, and most of the research is done on the cases of the people who are identified. But I think in terms of human trafficking, if you think of labor trafficking, it could be different migrant groups. Yeah, maybe even for China or.
We have to wrap it up. I appreciate that you stood a little to the students. 5 o'clock already. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this and sharing your work. I wish we just had worked better. It's our fault here with the technology. But I hope that you got a sense that what we're reading in this class, that issues about coloniality at large, how this still permeates and impacts lives today. In many, many countries, Portugal being one of them. And Portugal is really an understudied case, really interesting case. Mm-hmm. Lots of the problems we see there, we see them elsewhere as well. So I hope you get a sense that this matters, this is important work. Maybe this is an application of this kind of work that we do in the class. Thank you.
Thank you.